My name is Sherwood Wheeler. I was born in Fayetteville, North Carolina. Many people may know Fayetteville as being the home to Fort Bragg military base. Grew up on the family farm, which was east of Fayetteville along the Cape Fear River. One of the things on the farm, we had a shop, and my father, no matter what the job was, no matter how big or how small, it always went into the Wheeler shop. And if it was an engine or a transmission, one of my jobs was to stand there with the trouble light or the drop light, shining it, holding it for him, while he would take something apart and put it back together. And of course my mind was always, I'd rather be someplace else. Not knowing that, just standing there and watching, taking things apart became something that I enjoyed doing later. He was teaching me, and without me ever knowing that he was teaching me. And so that became something that I did later. In high school, I was involved with FFA, Future Farmers of America, and we also had an automotive session, and one of those was also to rebuild an engine and take things apart. And so I've always been used to doing things technical and being hands-on. While in the FFA, I was very involved with it. I was a vice president of the chapter, and my senior year I was the president of the chapter. FFA, there were other opportunities. I was part of a soil judging team. I was on parliamentary procedure team. I was a public speaker team. I did livestock judging. I was nominated, and I became a district officer for that part of eastern North Carolina. So very involved in FFA. Had a really good advisor. And I know as my senior year, one thing I remember about Mr. Boyd was that he had asked me what I was going to do after I graduated high school. And I remember mentioning something to him about, I was thinking about attending maybe the local community college there in Fayetteville, and he kind of shook his head. And it was a few weeks later or a month later, he had mentioned to me that there was some business we need to take care of in Raleigh, some FFA business. Now, I was a district officer, and he had cleared it that I could go up with him on a certain day, be absent from school. And as we got up to Raleigh, he said he needed to swing into the university a minute, so we pulled into NC State University. And I followed him into an office, and I remember a short time later, he came out, and it was the dean, and he said, "Mr. Wheeler, I understand you want to come to NC State University. We'd be more than happy for you." And so from that, I had no idea I was going to North Carolina State, but I did. And later, I happened to be in the office there, and the secretary had mentioned to me, she said, every year we expect to see Mr. Boyd come through those doors, and he's got some young man that he feels like, he's inquired about him, and he takes an interest in them. And he said he brings at least one or two up here every year for us. And so they come with good recommendations. And so I attended North Carolina State. I got a degree in ag. It was field crops and soil sciences, and my intention was to return home and farm. And I did after I graduated. I farmed with my father and my brother for a few years, and at some point I decided that I was going to look outside of the farm. And the local ag dealer, tractor dealer, had heard that I was leaving and had approached me and said he'd like for me to come to work for him. So I did. I tried sales for the first year until his service manager left him, and he asked me if I would run the shop temporarily, and that temporarily became permanent for the next few years because that was my niche. So I had responsibility for the shop. He gave me experience with equipment and other areas of just on-the-job training, working with hydraulics, doing flow tests, engines, rebuilding engines, just working with the technicians. The dealership was an ag tractor and also a light industrial dealer. And so we worked on not only farm equipment, but forklifts, backhoes, steel track crawlers, skid steer loaders. So there was the whole gamut from riding lawnmowers to the largest ag tractor they could build at the time. So it was a good learning experience. We did hay, we did planters, we did like I say, the whole gamut of ag equipment.
Was that in Fayetteville?
Yes, it was, and I ran the shop for about 8 years, 8 to 9 years, somewhere in that time frame. And
did they sell AGCO?
They were an Alice Chalmers dealer, also a New Holland dealer, and then we took on Ford, and then Alice eventually they went out of business and it became Deutz Alice, and then Ford had sold off and it became Ford New Holland. So I went from Alice Chalmers to Deutz Alice, and then it became AGCO. And Ford went to New Holland, which later became Case New Holland. So I grew up with both of with those brands, and so that was the reason that of me joining AGCO was that, as a service manager, I was always having conversations with their help desk, the factory support, and one of the men. They right after it became AGCO had called me, said they were it'd been a while since I'd talked with him, and he had asked me if I was interested in coming to work for AGCO. He said they needed somebody that had some Alice Chalmers and Deutz Alice experience, and he said the first one he thought of was me. So he had got a hold of my contact information and gave me a call. From that, they flew me up from North Carolina to Chicago. About 3 days later, I interviewed with them, and the next day he took me back to the airport and said, "Okay, we're waiting on you. When can you come?" So that's how my start with AGCO began. So very brief interview, very quick, and next thing I knew, my wife and I, we were moving from North Carolina to the Chicago area. Batavia is their parts center, but that's where their technical service was supported out of at the time. So we were there for less than a year, and AGCO relocated the technical service department from the Batavia, Illinois parts facility to Kansas City, where we had where the Gleaner combines were built. And so we were in Kansas City for about 7 years. While in Kansas City, I did technical support. I was speaking with service technicians across the U.S. and Canada. So it was one of those where you were the factory expert on a particular product, and for me it was wheel tractors. And so you were expected to know from the front weights to the drawbar on the rear of the tractor and everything in between. So if you got a call, you were considered the expert on that product, and I thoroughly enjoyed that role. I enjoyed every conversation I had with every tech, whether it was a pleasant one, and most were very pleasant. And it was always a good feeling of satisfaction when they called in, and some of these were very experienced guys, and it's one of those that get down to the point they start scratching their head as to, I don't know what's wrong. I've done what I think I'm supposed to do, but it's something still not right or whatever, and you're able to walk them through. You find out, you ask the questions, what's the problem? What have you done? And from that, then you start offering some suggestions or advice as to the next step. And also in the early years of AGCO, not only did we do technical support for helping service technicians out, but we also were responsible for developing training material. And so in the off season or in the winter months, we would begin developing our training material. We would do a train-to-trainer session. So in December, we'd always have our field people come in. We would spend a week with them, training them on the particular subject, whether it's a transmission or an engine or hydraulics. And then we would have that trainer back beginning in January, We'd have the dealers, technicians come in. I would go through the class. I'd go through, and then we'd sit through and let the field people take over and lead the dealer training after that. It was always good. The thing I enjoyed about that is many of the times the technicians I'd been talking with on the phone, whether they're in Canada or the U.S., they would be in class, and so all of a sudden now you got to put a name with a face. And we made a lot of good relationships with technicians just from that. And so many times they'd call in and they'd always want to talk to one particular person that they'd been dealing with because they just enjoyed it. And I enjoyed all the relationships and that I made over those years. And so, that way when they call, you've helped them in the past. They have pretty good confidence that you're going to help them now. Yeah. And also we would also had responsibility at the time for analyzing warranty claims. So that could be difficult sometimes, but you're not only are you helping them with their problems, but now all of a sudden you're seeing the warranty claims come through. And so there was always that fine line of properly decision in that claim. So that was always quite interesting to do tech support. And there were a few times I volunteered to write service manuals, which was, most people didn't volunteer for such things, but there was some time I did not feel like maybe the service manual was as robust as I would like, and so I remember the first time I walked in and I asked my manager of the department if it'd be okay if I rewrote the service manual on a particular product. He said, I think that's about the first time I've had anybody volunteer for a job like that, but have at it. And the manual was originally about 250 pages. I spent a year or a little better than a year rewriting the manual, and the publications manager had come to me and he told me later, he said, well, Sherwood, he said, you now hold the record for the largest workshop manual I think we've ever published. And it went from about 250 pages to about 1,250 pages. And so wow. I covered every part of that, that model series in detail. As far as tear down and the photography class I'd taken back in North Carolina one year, it was what paid off. So not only did I write it, I was also doing all my photography for the tear down and the rebuild. I showed techs not only how to use the proper tools, but I showed them in some cases even how to work around, a different way in case you did not have the special tool to also perform the task. Going back to the service manual, it seemed like we would get a lot of electrical calls because for me the wiring again the entire manual wasn't but 250 pages or so, and I remember I was able to get a drafting table, and for about a year I would sit at that drafting table after work or at night, and I just I drew every line diagram for that series of tractors. And so once that manual got published, we hardly ever got any wiring questions after that, any electrical questions, because not only did I do the overall wiring diagrams, but also did individual circuits. It was a lengthy project, but it was very worthwhile because the intent was to give information out to the, in a shop manual that a service technician could pick up and help himself. From that service manual, I ended up writing, I think it was 2 or 3 more service manuals. And on occasion, I'd have someone out in the field call me and say, Sherwood, you think you could rewrite this manual? I said, and so no, those days are somewhat behind me now. We have a publication department or a department that's handling the publications of manuals. So that was a load off of us or me, but I enjoyed that. I enjoyed the technical aspect, taking things apart, understanding them, how they're designed, how they're engineered, and then putting them back together. So it was a good time. So the role was very diverse. You know, you could come in and you were never seen to be doing the same thing twice in a day. I mean, it was a very diverse role to be in. That's how I ended up, you know, one year rewriting a air conditioning manual, and I and a colleague in England, we collaborated together on it. So we were going to do one for a global, but I ended up for the North America, I about doubled the size of it. But the official one, you know, it was not quite as it covered the basics. But when I did it for the North America department, I about doubled the size of that book. Well, I remember the first machine I ever did an AC job on, and that was my brother and I had purchased a second-hand Gaylord combine. And this was back in the days when air conditioning was optional. So you had to pay extra for it, and we had purchased a combine without air conditioning. And after the first summer running that machine, and it was, and the previous combine we had as well did not have air conditioning on it. So the second one we had bought, which was the Gaylord, it did not have air conditioning, but I decided after that summer, I said, you know, I've got to have air conditioning on this thing. So what I come across is there was a dealer who had a salvaged combine. I think there was a fire or something to it. I don't remember all the details other than I went in to get some parts, and I saw the combine, and I asked him about if I could purchase the AC parts off of it. So he sold me all the components for, I think it was $50. He said, for $50, go out and take anything related to the air conditioning off. So, you know, I had to get all the hoses and makeup, and so I had a shop manual on the combine, and I remember reading the AC section and making sure that you know, how to properly install it, and reading about vacuum. And so I had to borrow some equipment from somebody local that in order to do a vacuum on evacuation of the system, and then recharged it, and it actually worked. So we ran that combine with air conditioning for the next few years. So that was somewhat of my beginnings. It wasn't until I went to work for AGCO. I remember taking some calls on occasion from people asking air conditioning questions. And so I would ask, well, who in the office here, you know, should be probably is the AC person to go to, and I might get directed to this one person or someone else, and I would come away with, you know, I'm not sure if they know any more than I do. So fortunately in Kansas City, there's at Lee Summit, there was Longview Community College, and that college had an automotive department that was supported by Ford Motor and General Motors and Toyota, and had a Common Core air conditioning class. And so I would attend that class at nighttime and went through courses on it, because it was right at the time when there was transitioning from R12 to 134A, and I really wanted to understand, okay, what's the difference between the two refrigerants? And it was during that, while taking that class, that there were some things that maybe I really didn't understand well, that the light bulb seemed to come on in my head. And all of a sudden, AC became a lot more simpler than it was, you know, not that many months prior to that. From that, after that, we were doing retrofits. I was asked if I could, they were asking if anyone could write service bulletins on how to retrofit from R12 to 134, and I volunteered to do that. Published bulletins on each of the brands. I think there was about 7 or 8 service bulletins I wrote based on the brand at that time on how to retrofit. Much of it was following the SAE guidelines. Did not stray very far from that. From that, it seemed that I was asked if I could put on a training class for air conditioning for the dealers. So I put on a 4, I think it was the first time it was a 4-hour, half-a-day session. And I was asked later on if I could, and to do another training session, in which I did, and it was from that later is what got me into writing the training manual, updating it, and so when there were more difficult issues that came along, people were having problems, or else there was something from straight out of the factory. Maybe there's a performance cooling complaint, and trying to understand it, I was getting more involved in those. And as a result of that, early on, I started attending AMACA, their training and trade shows, and that had to be about the mid-1990s, 90, 94, 95, somewhere along there, just because it seems like I was getting more questions about air conditioning, and people were coming to me now for answers on air conditioning. I said, well, I need some more, more information myself. So I began looking to see where I could get that type of training, and that's when I learned about AMACA. And so in the beginning, I'd take a vacation once a year whenever the AMACA event came around, or I'd take a few days of vacation and I would travel to that event. And so there were, I would sit in those training classes, or those sessions of each one, and I'd usually take a pad of notes, a page, 1, 2, 3, 4 pages of notes of things that people would talk about. I remember Wayne Herndon for sure sitting in one of his classes and him talking about every vehicle that came out of his shop. They'd always monitor the compressor housing temperature. They'd run it, and that would, and I'm sitting there thinking temperature, compressor housing temperature. So what's the key point? What's the reason for that? It dawned on me later about the A6 compressors, how they had the superheat switch in the back, so that it was monitoring, I guess, the housing temperature as well. And so, okay. From that, I asked one of our test engineers, who was over our test facility down in Arizona, asked him, I said, have we ever looked at what our compressor housing temperature should run on a tractor? Because it got me thinking about that. And so from that, he had 2 tractors in Phoenix, Arizona, instrumented up. They wired up the compressors on them. And after a couple of summers, he said they'd also put a temp probe on the suction line temperature. And what they saw consistently was that whatever the suction line temperature was, the compressor housing temperature ran 100 degrees above that. So if suction line was 50, they were constantly seeing 150. So we saw that correlation between suction line versus compressor housing temperature. From that, it got me interested in, okay, what about other temperatures around this vehicle? So then I started measuring, doing the condenser inlet and outlet evaporators. I mean, for all this was field test, or excuse me, not field test, but so much for the service technician out in the field. I know engineering, they do similar, fit-ups and testing, but I was looking for ways that if a service technician, one of the dealerships called and he was fighting an AC complaint, how could we quickly and more effectively diagnose that unit? Most of the time, the only information they could come back with us was, well, these are my pressures, and this is my vent temperature. And we really needed more than that. And so from that, we developed a temperature test sheet for dealers to fill out. I started faxing those out, and one of the questions on there I would always ask is compressor housing temperature. And so that would give me an idea as to whether or not we were getting adequate refrigerant vapor back to the compressor, or 2, if the compressor was running particularly warm. For example, if it's got the right charge in it, but yet we were still running excessive of the 100 plus, 100 over suction line temperature. My question was why? So for me, it was always there was a need to take that measurement. I had a baseline. And even today we still send out that temperature test sheet to technicians if they call in. They've got a particular issue they're fighting, because you got to remember, off-road ag, it's in a very harsh environment. It's working in conditions that a passenger car doesn't work in. So you got condensers can be plugging, evaporators can be plugging. You've got different dynamics going on. And so you can't always just go by pressures. For us in diagnosing and trying to get down to the root cause is temperature. So that's really been one thing that I have been very adamant on. People know in the office that if they come to me to help with an AC question, they know the very first thing I'm going to want to see is the data sheet. Give me the numbers. It's really just a snapshot of the system, but at least it's a starting point. And usually, sometimes I'll have someone walk in the office. Into my office. They'll have the sheet filled out, and I'll look at it, and I'll go down through the numbers, and there's your problem. I'll just draw a circle around it. Here's where your focus is. And then they'll walk in, and we always emphasize we want to take those numbers using a contact temp probe, not an infrared heat gun. And they'll walk in, and if they lay the sheet down in front of me, I said, okay, go back and ask the tech. Leave his infrared temp gun in the box and go back to a contact temp probe, because the numbers just don't add up. So I know when I can tell the difference when they're using a contact temp or if they're using an infrared gun. So that's one thing that has really caused me to zero in more and more on AC and diagnostics. My experience is a lot of my involvement has just been diagnosing problems. Why doesn't the system perform the way we're expecting it to perform? The other one I've I started getting involved with, and that is using micron gauges. And I've been using micron gauges since about 2000 now. And so vacuum, we've always grew up with using a mechanical set of gauges to do vacuum with. My first gauge I got was it was a digital set. I was going after it more for the digital part of it to display pressures and temperatures. It had a couple other features with it. One, it would do superheat, one for subcooling, and then it had a micron gauge built into it as well. And so the micron gauge is the one that I started learning more about and the importance of it in pulling a deep vacuum. And so over time I've incorporated a lot of that into my training. I've visited with some technical colleges, and trying to get some of the instructors to start incorporating micron gauges into their classroom. Today I'll hire a new tech into our department, and many of them have gone through courses on air conditioning, and invariably they all say the same thing. None of them have ever heard of a micron gauge until they showed up at AGCO, and it was never introduced in their course. So I've been trying to change that mindset. It's may not be something that automotive is utilizing, but in our area, in off-road ag, when we were talking about such large systems, I mean, we have systems as far as the combines, we're running 6 1/4 pounds, in those combines, or 100 ounces. How do you know you've gotten all the flush out of a system? How do you know you've gotten the moisture out of the system? A set of mechanical dial gauges doesn't show that. And so one of the things I've been emphasizing over the past, 15 years is the need and the use of a micron gauge to be able to know that you've pulled a deep vacuum, to know that you've got a system that's free of moisture. If you flush the system, that's the only way you're going to know you've gotten all the flush out of it, or that the system is dry. Mechanical dial gauges are not going to display that. So that's another item that has been very close to me, and one that I've been trying to change within our industry. That dealers and service technicians, that's an investment that will be well worth its value. And they've become so inexpensive these days. I don't know why an AC service technician would not have one in his toolbox. Well, one of the things is this past year we did release the AGCO Mantooth kit, which is made by Yellow Jacket, which is a wireless device. It interfaces with your mobile device, and so you're able to data log your pressures, your temperatures, your superheat, your subcooling, but it also allows you to, has a micron sensor as well that comes with the kit. So you're able to also record the vacuum session. And so we, this past year, we did a Top Tech video for AGCO University on how to use the man tooth, using it, going through the app, how to use it, how to record a pressure temperature session, how to record a vacuum session. And it's a good way of documenting, one, the complaint. It also helps you to document the repair, that you've properly performed it, and also the vacuum session. So if there's any questions about, did the technician do this or that, if he's using the kit or using the tool, the app, he can record those. He can at least keep those on file for his customers if a question came up about the repair. I was involved with a MAC or attending a MACA sessions, their annual events, up until AMACA and MACS joined. And that was at that point that I started attending the MACS events. And still saw some of the same faces, some of the same people that were, that would be invited for the training sessions at AMACA. So I continued to absorb all of the knowledge that I could. So there were a lot of mentors along the way. Back those guys who would come and every year and do training sessions at AMACA, and then continuing on with MACS. There was a lot of mentoring, whether people knew it or not. That they were definitely mentoring me anyway. And even though a lot of it was automotive, there would be a good portion of it. I could all of a sudden, when it seems like ag was always lagging behind a bit, and so things that I would learn about automotive, air conditioning, and maybe something has changed, in the way they're doing something or whatever. Pretty soon I started to apply it to ag, and look at how we could do things a little differently or better, or there's new tools out there that maybe we weren't utilizing. And so every event, there's always something new I would pick up on and learn. And so AGCO's been very supportive of my involvement with MACS and in every way. That I've thoroughly enjoyed my time, and I eventually joined MACS, and then I was invited to begin to present one year, and from that I've been asked a few more times to come back and present. I've enjoyed them every time. Continue to enjoy these events and learning from others, because there's a lot of good valuable knowledge that's at these sessions every year. I always try to involve not only just updating about the product, there's a TSB on this or changer here, but I've always tried to somewhere include training about something in my presentations, because I've always dealt with service technicians, and I've always been in the technical service side. My entire career at AGCO has been in technical service. It's not in the same role. I've had, I think, 4 different roles within technical service department, but I'm always, I'm always present from the standpoint, if I were a service technician sitting out in the audience, what would be of interest to me? And yes, I think it's important. For me, it was always, I try to gear my presentations that I do each year at MACS with that AC service technician who may be sitting out there, or that technical college instructor that is sitting there. what can I share with them that will be of benefit and value, so that when they leave MACS and they leave my session, they've got something they can take back home with them and utilize. Well, there is one special project, that I'd worked on with, it was a few years ago. We had come out with our new vision cab, and prior to that vision cab, I was contacted by one of our software engineers that my name had been given to him about air conditioning. And so I went over and met with him, and we talked about it. And one of the things that he developed out of that, and in working with him, is that we looked at what sensors there were going to be on the combines, and so we came up with a graphical diagram so that when the service technician went to the combine, if there was a cooling complaint or if he wanted to see the HVAC system, when he connected the diagnostic tool, and it's AGCO, it's called Electronic Diagnostic Tool, or EDT, when he would connect to the machine, he could pull up the HVAC system, and it has an image of an AC system, so it shows an image of a compressor, evaporator, condenser, the dryer. He could select between a machine that has a external dryer or one that has an IRD, integrated receiver dryer, and at that point it would start displaying any data that it's pulling from the sensors off of the machine. So the technician could actually do a screenshot. He could download the data. He could see, and if there was a sensor that was not, incorporated into the machine, it would be grayed out. But he could actually click on it and manually enter a number or a data. He could actually manually take that reading and then plug it in, download it and export it, and if he needed additional help from our technical service department or the help desk, he could send that to him or attach it to a case and for help in diagnosing the problem. So it's something that's incorporated even today and being used. So with the intent that in the future, if we do add an additional sensor or to the machine, that we've already got the box ready for it. All we need to do is start populating it. As far as the future for ag, one thing I see is that right now is still the fixed displacement compressor staying around, because I know you're looking at horsepower, but when you're talking a 550 horsepower tractor, a compressor that's pulling 3 horsepower is nothing. So we don't look so much, I believe, to the demand that the AC compressor is using or the horsepower it's pulling versus, because the equipment is so massive, it's so, we got a hydraulic pump that may be taking 60 horsepower versus an AC compressor that's only pulling 2 or 3 or 3 or 4 or whatever. So we're not too concerned about, that side of it, or right now it doesn't seem as though we are. That's a good, reliable compressor. It has been. As far as what we are seeing more and more of is we're seeing less and less manual AC control panels that are being ordered, sold to the end user. We're seeing more and more automatic systems, and so that seems to be the direction that things are going right now, is more automatic systems. On the smaller tractors, the compacts, the utility mid-range tractors, yes, the manual AC systems are still there. But once you get into the larger tractors, combines and windrowers, we're starting to see the automatic systems of a greater demand for those. In the future, I don't see a lot changing, from that point. The things, there's a lot of things engineering has to work out, and the engine group, as far as component locations, and then we're starting to look at the new refrigerant, and then all of a sudden you have to start looking at, lines and just the difference in the two characteristics of 134 versus the 1234YF. So those are things that we'll have to take in consideration, in the future here. Well, one thing is with off-road heavy duty or off-road ag, construction, mining, the AC systems are still basic AC systems. They still carry a large amount of refrigerant in some cases. Our tractors will normally run, the average mid to range tractors, will run anywhere, 48 ounces of refrigerant right on up to the combines, which are 6 1/4. You've got other other machines that may be certainly running larger systems, more refrigerant. And the one thing that is still going to remain the same is servicing. You still got to contend with the harsh environments, the vibration, the leaks, or the plugging, the diagnosing, the troubleshooting. We're still into that mode, and I don't see that changing. Versus automotive, their systems are getting smaller. You're more on highway, and so in this industry, you got new technicians come in, and that are maybe were trained with passenger cars, automotive, and now they come into this industry, and we have guys that are transitioning from automotive into this industry all the time, and there's a large there's a learning curve, and what they learned about passenger cars maybe in a college course someplace or technical school, they're having to change their way of diagnosing, troubleshooting, off-road ag, just because of the system. It's still a basic system, but we have a different set of problems. And I know that you've seen some probably increase in training requirements for heavy duty, and I believe that's why. It's because we're really going back to the basics of the way systems have worked in the past. One other thing is MACS is certainly proactive in offering technicians service information with their mobile app. One of the things, in bringing up that mobile app, it reminds me of also the need for refrigerant capacities in the correct amount. And I think it was in the first time I was asked to speak, which was back in 2008, one of the requests had gone out to those of us in the ag industry from MACS was that could we provide refrigerant capacities. I took that serious, and so took that on and started working on our refrigerant capacities, and went back and got the data from the early 1970s right on up through current, still keep it current, of all the refrigerant capacities for all the different brands, the makes, the models, the capacities, any footnotes about those particular systems that might be unique if there was a capacity change, and provided those, and we do, because the thing we want is that when a service technician goes to a piece of our equipment or an AGCO brand, legacy equipment or a current, we'd rather you have the right information. How much does it really hold? And so we make that available to MACS for their mobile app, and our dealers, we provide it to them as well. And that's really I think their number one go-to place for refrigerant capacities. The MACS app or to the AGCO site where we have it posted as well. So it's always been the number one hit, I think, of the documents we have out there is always our refrigerant capacity chart. Well, my advantage is I was in the technical service. I'm in the technical service department, and we're involved with technical service and with information. And so I was I'll say I was in the right department to be able to gather that information. The other thing we looked at, and I've learned, is check this, compare the owner's manual to the workshop manual. And sometimes you might find someone, when they do publications, it's pretty true. They'll copy, maybe save a copy of the old manual, and they'll go in and make some changes to the specs. And sometimes maybe there's someone overlooks that, the refrigerant capacity changed, and so we kind of vet those before they go into to my document. So we'll compare both. We'll compare the shop manual to the owner's manual. Do they say the same? And we'll also, and if we see discrepancies, we'll go back and give clarification for engineering. What should it be? You know, to make sure we're publishing the right one. So I think that's probably why our dealers go to the capacity manual or the document first, and can rely upon it.